This week on the BackTable podcast.
He was actually appalled because he thought this was totally unfair. My salary was higher than his. And he had been on the faculty. And he discussed this at some lunch with his chair of the Department of Computer Science. And it turned out my salary was higher than his, too. And they both were saying, this is really unfair. My starting salary should be higher than the chair of computer science. And Ed came over, I remember, and he talked to me about this. He said, how can this be? He said, but you just finished your training. And I thought, well, he says, I spent a lot of time doing things, but you could say, what are jobs worth?
Welcome to BackTable Urology and SWIU, the Society of Women in Urology. This is our Legends series. My name is Martha Terris. I'm Chief of Urology at the Medical College of Georgia, and I have the distinct pleasure of interviewing Linda Shortliffe. Linda was the first chair of a major urology program in the country, first woman chair. She was the first woman on the American Board of Urology Trustees, first president female of the American Board of Urology. She was first president of the Society of University Urologists, the precursor to the current Society of Academic Urologists, and many others. So really a trailblazer, and the first woman to graduate from the Stanford Urology program, where she served as chair and was junior faculty when I was a resident there. So it's great to have this reunion and talk about what it's like to be such a trailblazer. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you. And thank you for that introduction, Martha.
Sure. It was all from memory. I hope I didn't miss anything major. But my fondest memory of Linda doesn't have anything to do with urology, really. I had just had my first baby as a resident in urology there at Stanford, and he was in the NICU, of course. And Linda was the pediatric urologist for Stanford. And she walked into the NICU and realized I hadn't even been able to hold the baby before. And of course, she's a god to everybody in the NICU, right? So she starts pulling over a rocking chair and having the nurse disconnect him and put him in my arms. And I will be forever grateful for that, because it probably would have been days before I'd been able to hold my baby before Linda came in and knocked some heads around in the NICU.
I remember that day as if it were yesterday, because I was so worried about your baby being in the NICU.
Yeah, and now he's great, just for everybody out there. He's graduated from Duke and is doing extremely well, so it all ended well. But let's get back on topic. So that sort of leadership, of course, is important. I mean, just the compassion and the appreciation for our work-life balance. And we just had the annual SWIU meeting, and a lot of the topics were on that. But then we come home and it's the nitty-gritty of surviving day in and day out, training residents, mentoring junior faculty, and doing our job. So a lot of the things we read about women in leadership in predominantly male specialties cite the lack of women leaders being mentors to women. And you trained where there were no women mentors. All of your mentors were male. How much of a difference do you think it makes having a same gender mentor?
I think mentors are very important. I also think that friends and colleagues of any gender are really important to your progress, to your career. And for example, I started at the VA, and you probably remember me at the VA, and one of the faculty interviewees came in to try to find me because they were supposed to interview with me at the VA. They couldn't find me because I had no secretary, or I had a half-time secretary. So he was quite upset about this. He says, you don't even really have a real office here. And I said, well, this is what I'm used to here. He suggested that, he says, you should talk to Dick Williams at UC San Francisco. He's got a great office. He said, we had a wonderful office, because this was Ralph Klayman, who he says, in Minneapolis, our VA is the big place. We have a whole bunch of assistants. And he says, there's, if you don't even have a secretary here, how can you get anything done? And that was the first time I realized that here he was telling me how I could do this. And I called Dick Williams, who I had known a little bit at a distance. And he told me how I could work out getting a secretary, what kinds of data I could use, how I could show that the service was growing. And I soon had a full-time secretary. And I think that these are on the level of colleagues more than mentors, because we were actually, believe it or not, Ralph was interviewing for a job at the VA at that point. And we were somewhat, Ralph was ahead of me because he had done the fellowship, but he was able to help me with this. And I think we forget that sometimes our mentors are friends or colleagues. And forever after that, Dick Williams, who I really miss these days, was a tremendous mentor to me. He was able to help me whenever I had difficulties in these kinds of things. So I think we do forget about that. As for mentors, though, they are really important in a different way. And I did have a mentor. I think this is why it becomes very important where you train and who the people are that are wanting to help you and the way they help you. As you know, we started out in a program where we were a little bit isolated from many of the other programs. And most of the people had been trained at the same place and didn't know a lot of people on the outside. But in fact, when I chose to go to Philadelphia, which was one of the important decisions, I thought, if I'm going to retrain in pediatric urology, and I'd already been on the faculty at that time, I thought I'd try to go to a good place, either Boston Children's, Philadelphia, or Toronto were the big places that I thought we could train at. And John Duckett was really the mentor, that unbelievable mentor. We've had lots of different stories about John and the fact that I found it difficult at first. But in fact, he became my best mentor because he's the one who told me, you need to be a part of national urology. You can't just sit there. And he nominated me for the for the boards committee, the AUA joint ABU boards committee, which was where I met a lot of people. And he nominated me for a lot of different things that I would have never suspected. So it was a wonderful opportunity. And that's, I think, the true mentorship that I received. And that's why I think it's really important. It doesn't matter male or female. It's the style of mentoring.
I agree 100%. I mean, you, of course, were a great mentor to me as a female leader, a model, and you nominated me to the GU surgeons, and I'm forever grateful for that. But you're a pediatric urologist, I'm an oncologist, right? So many of my specialty mentors were and still are people in my subspecialty field. So I think it takes a village, doesn't it? You don't have one mentor that's the one person you look up to. I mean, I look up to you for how to be a female leader, but I may look up to somebody else about how to manage a cancer practice, right? So it really, looking for one main mentor, I think, is a mistake. You pick and choose, and it may be somebody that you don't really agree with their personal life choices, or maybe you don't agree with some other aspects of their practice, but they're doing one thing really, really well, and you'd like to model that aspect of your career after them. So it doesn't really matter. It's nice. I mean, it was a luxury to have you as a mentor, but I don't think it has to be same gender.
And I think it's important that people reach out. I was afraid to reach out for a lot of my career. If you're the only one in the room and you could say you're looking at the rest of the room or somebody, you're a little bit always on. And that's stressful and exhausting. I think people forget that part of it.
Especially for us introverts, right?
Yes, exactly. That it's you're doing something that's not natural to you.
Mm-hmm.
And to reach out to people to ask questions, to ask them, how did you do this? Or why did you think this? Is actually an opening that sometimes these people then later become your mentors.
They do. And they're flattered, right? That you respect them enough and respect what they've accomplished enough that you would even ask. I think the message to our listeners is, don't be shy going up to someone who you respect, who you would like to emulate, and ask questions and approach them. Absolutely. We turn turn it around the other way, we've talked about us being mentored. When you are mentoring other individuals, is there a different style you have when mentoring men versus women?
No, I don't think so. And that's part of, I think, is, as you know, being a chair, but also being residency director, which you did as well, that you have to support everyone. And of course, many of the people that when I started helping with the residency were all male. So I wasn't even thinking of gender, but I wanted to help them. And so I think that the mechanisms and the ways I wanted to help them were probably the same for both.
Yeah, I think so too. I anticipated some difficulty. I read books from on coaches talking about coaching women versus coaching men. And there was a lot, and these were men, of course, writing these books. And there was, the general thought was, well, with women, you have to kind of befriend them first. They have to like you first, and then they'll allow you to coach them. Whereas men, you can be, rough with and, criticize, and they'll bounce right back. And that may be true coming from a male mentor, but I don't even think that's true. I find that if you treat everybody equally, they respect that. And you may have
Agree.
more in common with your female mentees as far as work-life balance or being the shortest person in the OR or something like that. But as far as learning the urology, learning how to operate, that's the same regardless of your gender.
Right. No, I agree totally. And I think that it's interesting. I can think of only 2 times when I had to fire residents actually, or, suggest they needed to go in a different direction. And the woman that I had to counsel in this way, her response was quite different. She didn't say anything, and she actually went to tell people that I was crazy and that I was moody, that I made rash decisions on no basis, and told people outside the department. It became a sort of a major problem. And believe it or not, there were residents in other programs who were afraid of me after this. So much so that the hospital director said, we've been working on this issue with this person for 2 years, and she's apparently spreading this. And the reason I found out was because her co-resident said, she's saying some things about you that aren't very nice. And she says, I know this is all confidential, but he said, I've sort of been wondering why it is you won't fire her. She said, because there's some real issues here. That was her response. Meanwhile, one of the males who I had to, which was a very difficult decision because it was late in the program and we had to make a change. And I said, maybe this is just not the correct field. We are still friends to this day. It's been 15 years maybe. He went to a different field. He asked me, would I please write him some letters, to explain sort of what happened and why he was looking for a different area. He went totally through a different residency. And to this day, he actually sends me Christmas cards, told me, he got married and can correspond. So I think, we
great.
can't stereotype people.
Yeah, no, that's true. But it kind of gets to one of my few other questions, though. I mean, the perception of women mentors is that we are nicer and kinder and are not going to be as critical. But if you're a good mentor, I mean, you have to give negative feedback sometime. And I think the blowback when you give that and you're perceived as the supposed nice person is much more dramatic, like you described. Is even for men sometimes it's, oh, she's just emotional. It must be the wrong time of the month. She must be having trouble at home that she's taking this out on me, rather than, no, it's that you didn't finish your notes last week. That has nothing to do with, and yes, I called you on it, but I don't know what your thoughts are on the response you get to negative feedback from both men and women.
I think that this happened with faculty who I had to give negative feedback because we had their annual reviews and sometimes there were some issues. The other sort of difficult part of this was that actually at the beginning, most of my faculty had all been in my faculty. They had trained me. They were older than I was. And from one of these people, their comment was, I think you perceive that of me because it's a cultural or a gender issue. They actually, in those days, there was no, you could say, people just said what they thought.
There was no DEI,
no, there was
political
no,
correctness.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so they just said, and that was the comment, was that it's you that's perceiving that, not me. And I said, well, actually, this comment isn't coming from me. It's from the residents. This is we had the evaluations and there were some comments, and this is why I'm saying these things, that the residents are having some difficulties in these areas with you. And that was the eye-opener. I think probably you could say going back to database information, or at least that it's not just you that sense this.
No, that's an excellent point. So, I mean, you have your fellow faculty members that you can use as sounding boards, or your chief residents or whoever, when you have these situations. And you're right. If you can talk to someone else about it and be sure that it's not just you perceiving it, and you present it as that to the person that's getting the negative feedback. And it doesn't even have to be your faculty. It can be nurses in the OR, whoever is giving you that feedback, that negative feedback to convey to that faculty member or resident. It does add more validity and can diffuse them taking out their frustrations with the negative feedback on you as a person rather than self-reflecting on the bad behavior. That's an excellent point. Now, on to a happier topic. There are a few women chairs and chiefs of urology across the country, but you've been mentored to many of us. So Una Lee in Washington, she's head of the program there. Larissa Rodriguez at Cornell, and myself. And you're not pushy with your mentoring. You more lead by example, from my experience at least. Why do you think you've been so successful?
I'm glad you think of me as a mentor, because if sometimes you feel like you're just working so hard to stay in position, you could say keep going, but I think in particular, I've thought of you all as friends, because you often feel very alone in these positions, and I think just thinking about you is helpful to me. And whether it's thinking about when people say, okay, this committee, we need some suggestions for this committee. I often think of all of you. I want to listen. I know that many of you have had difficult situations as I have, and life is filled with these, unfortunately. And many of them I've gone through similarly without having anyone to talk to about it. And so I feel listening is really important. And the other is I watched, I think it was at one of the AUA program committees or something. And they were going around the room with ideas. And I watched some of the other chairs that were chairs. It was, I could do a talk on this, or we could have a program, a lead program on this, or a committee, at the AUA on this topic. I thought, gee, this is weird. I guess, yeah, they are the big names, but it seems to me that we'd sort of like to get some of the other people that aren't even in our field. And so I sort of said, I think maybe we should have something in oncology. Oncology, even though I'm pediatric, has always been one of my favorite areas. So we should have, and might think of these people. And I was thinking of other people on my faculty who could do it. And then later, one of the other chairs said, that was interesting, you said that, because he says, everybody else was sort of suggesting they should lead something, and you suggested where your faculty should lead it. He said that was, I don't think I've watched that so much, that, you said one of the programs on this. And he said that was, I thought that was good. He says you weren't even going into pediatric urology, which sometimes, some of the other people don't want to hear too much about pediatric urology. So giving other people credit, thinking of them, and encouraging to do what they want to do. I sometimes think that when I have been asked about, should I do this or should I make this decision, my advice has been taken negatively in some ways, because I've said, I think you shouldn't stay. That may be the best choice is you go to this fellowship, not, you don't stay here, you go someplace that, or you don't, and I know that afterwards I've spoken with some of the people, they said their thought was, no, she really doesn't like me, she doesn't want me around. But in fact, that's sometimes the best way to know other people.
Mm-hmm.
And we all know that there are it's important to know people in your field and circles of people. And your friends and colleagues are sometimes your best mentors, helpers. You have to reach out to those kinds of people. And the best way is to train with them. So I sort of feel that has sometimes, I think, some people have wondered, geez, why would you say go someplace else, go to this program? But in fact, it's because I'm really thinking the best, not for me and maybe even our program would be to keep some people, but in fact, it's better for them to go someplace else.
No, that's so true. Both of the points that you've made. Number one, I think, there's a lot of self-promotion among the leadership in our field, but it's becoming more open to promoting the younger generation and getting earlier career individuals involved in these high-profile AUA programs, for example. And that natural instinct to promote somebody else over yourself, I think, is an important aspect of your leadership, and certainly one I try to emulate, that when you're building a department, I started with something small here and have worked, number one, not to let it fall apart, but number two, to build it into something bigger. And you don't get to do that through self-promotion. You've got to lift up everyone on the faculty and the residency training and even the medical students. I don't know when this is airing, but the match was just yesterday. And to have so many medical students from our school go to great places, I mean, that's the best thing that can happen to us, right? So that's critical to promoting your success.
I think opening up to the outside, and actually when you came, pretty much all our faculty have been trained at our own institution.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, you don't have the outreach at that point. You can't say, gee, I'm interested in oncology. Maybe I should talk to several people. You only have the people at your own institution because, and we weren't, of course, probably remember the strange thing, we weren't encouraged to go to the AUA when I was a resident.
No, not to the section meeting, not to the AUA.
I never went to the AUA as a resident. So that probably, in some ways I was like the unruly child, that I did just the opposite that I had been trained to do.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Again, talking about promoting women faculty, there are certain issues with women faculty, especially early in their career or residents, that you just have to deal with, right? And certainly when I was going through, we went through all three of my pregnancies with me. I had two during residency and one as a junior faculty member, and you were incredibly supportive during that. But can you speak to how you think maternity leave and, any kind of physical ailments impact promotion and tenure or job selection or things like that how you advise women that have, the biological imperative that might get in the way of their career a bit?
It's funny, Martha, I don't even remember. I mean, other than the episodes of seeing you in the NICU and knowing that you had the babies, I don't remember your pregnancy leave. And as anything as part of, that, and it's probably because I don't see that kind of leave as, I mean, clearly it's important that, and later Stanford came up with pregnancy leave. I don't think that there was even a time that when you were having your children, and clearly when I had them, we didn't have there was no policy.
We had no policy. No.
Yeah, there was no policy. And so, and because women were they were concerned themselves, I think, that it was more about the job you did, not about when you were gone.
Yeah.
And so I don't really think of that as, now there are sort of instituted policies, but I've been fortunate maybe. Everybody I've dealt with, it's not been an issue, so I haven't thought about it.
None of us had been like out for months with preeclampsia or anything. So, but there wasn't a policy, and my approach was just to take a whole bunch of call leading up to when I delivered so that everybody owed me by the time that I took off, because there was no official policy. It's just part of life, and everybody kept going on. So it was almost better not to have a policy, because the department there handled all 3 of my pregnancies extremely well. I can't say that I'm unhappy at all with that. Now, I timed them for when I was going to have a research rotation and stuff like that. It was the last one when I was already a junior faculty member. You got volunteers to come over to the VA and cover cases for me. And it was just an expectation that that's what people would do. So it worked out great.
I think that most people are quite understanding. And of course, one of the reasons I went into urology is I think in general, urologists have, one, a great sense of humor because of what we deal with, and two, that the people are kind. I think that's one of the reasons it's clearly one of the reasons that I stayed in urology. But so I can't say that about everyone, but that I had no difficulties with, trying to find people to cover and this is something that I will be forever grateful for. When I was at the VA, I actually wasn't certain what I should do because nobody said anything. And finally, at one point, somebody said, I think at a faculty meeting, looked at me and said, "Do you have something to tell us?" And I said, "Well, or do you have an endocrine disorder?" That was the comment. I said, "Well, I guess I do." And they said, "Well, when do you expect to be out, or when do you expect to deliver?" And I said, "Oh, in about 3 months." They said, "Oh." And there was no further discussion. And there was no comment about what I was going to do or anything. So then I continued in the OR, and it was quite obvious what was going on. And some of the outside urologists who used to help me from El Camino, the El Camino group, came and said, "Well, what do you plan to do?" I said, "Well, I don't really know yet." And now it was getting to be about 2 months. I said, nobody said anything. They said, "How about if we, rather than come every week, that we come a couple of times a week, or more of us come?" I said, "Geez, that would be really helpful to me." That would be. And he said, "Yeah, I'm sure that the guys at El Camino are happy to help more often in the operating room. We like it." So they did come. They helped cover for about 3 weeks. A couple of people came and helped cover the clinics. And the resident who was with me looked at me and said, "I think I'm going to schedule my vacation for the time that you're gone." That's what he did.
That's good.
He had a resident from the lab covering. So that was how, but the whole thing was that people were incredibly kind. And that doesn't probably happen in all situations. You can't bet on it.
You're absolutely right. And that's one of the selling points when I talk to medical students, our medical student interest group for urology. And that's one of the selling points, right, is you can be a surgeon without being a jerk. The urologists are pretty nice people. I don't think I ever told you this, but when I had my first child, Tom Stamey was still chair. This is before you took over. And the most old-fashioned, traditional values kind of guy you would expect. So I was hesitant to tell him I was expecting, but I did. And he was like, "Oh, that's all right, honey." It says, "I learned from Linda Shortliffe that's just no problem. She just had a baby and kept going." So,
I was only gone for 3 weeks. That's why. And he never made a comment, or a move to help. So
no, you clearly greased the wheels for the rest of us there, because you made it work out. Well, certainly it wasn't as traumatic. The one thing he did say, and I've actually said this as well to people I mentor, he said, "I'd recommend, though, that you not be pregnant your chief resident year. You operate more than you'll ever operate again in your life. Just so much learning happens that year. I'd probably recommend against that, but you do whatever you want to do." He was very reasonable about it. And I thought that was actually pretty good advice, too, that the chief year is a valuable year, and taking off some extra months during that time is probably a little bit difficult. So on another less than fun topic, we've both been told at certain stages of our career that we don't need a raise or a higher salary because our spouse makes a good salary. And somehow tying our value to that when we were earlier in our career. And then now as leaders, we have our male faculty come to us and say things like that they need a raise because their wife is a stay-at-home mom. So somehow they're more valuable because their wife doesn't work. So how do you address those types of questions or that way of thinking?
So yes, we both came into that and have many examples of being told that. But as I had to recruit different people from various different areas to a difficult place where things were expensive, I started thinking about, what is the worth of a job? Because it doesn't really have anything to do with the other issues. It's almost more environmental in some ways. And as an aside, I think I told you this before, Martha, when I started on the faculty 3 years after my ex-husband, who was already on the faculty in the Department of Medicine and was an MD, PhD, he was actually appalled because he thought this was totally unfair. My salary was higher than his. And he had been on the faculty. And he discussed this at some lunch with his chair of the Department of Computer Science. And it turned out my salary was higher than his, too. And they both were saying, this is really unfair.
No, you're a surgeon. Your training was longer.
And so that my starting salary should be higher than the chair of computer science. And Ed came over, I remember, and he talked to me about this. He said, how can this be? He said, but you just finished your training. And I thought, well, he says, I spent a lot of time doing things. It's not but you could say, what are jobs worth? So I think that when it came to recruiting people and actually raises and the kind of bonusing we could give, it was really tried to be merit-based. And I talked with one of the other people who later became chair at another department. He had asked me about this when he came to interview, and he said, I never heard of that kind of salary basing. He says, it makes total sense. But he said, you sort of put what percentage of research, what percentage clinical time, and okay, where do the dollars come from? The clinical people, so they have to be rewarded for that, and they may not have time to do the research. But then some of the department's gains as a national place come from the research. So we sort of have to make allowances for all of these things. In a complicated way, we came out with some sort of merit-based recognitions. I don't know that that's happening anymore, but it was something that I thought was important to try and recognize, at least that people were going to be, it was not going to be on the fact of how many people are working in your family and where are they working. So those were the kinds of things that we tried. And the fact that we were in housing was very important. So that was part of recruitment. Fortunately, university help rather than, the departmental recognition of that kind of thing. And, there was even, I think, just maybe you fell into it as well, the parity agreement between the VA and Stanford. It didn't matter. Your salary was based by the provost at Stanford University. And it did turn out that when I had been on the faculty about 5 or 6 years, they used to publish these things. And after it became almost recognizable who I was because they had years in service, rank, and gender is for comparison, because they were having to do these comparison studies. It became recognizable I was in the Department of Surgery. There was no one else. And I was the lowest paid person in the whole department. And we were still part of the Department of Surgery at that time. And in fact, that was not only because probably some of those issues had been felt that I didn't need the salary maybe, but the other was that there was an issue of parity between the VA and Stanford, and the department had just sort of chosen to not recognize that. Stanford people, they felt, worked harder than those at the VA, so they got a different salary. And what I brought this up because I would get the provost's letter every year saying what my salary was. And I said, it's sort of strange, but every year, I think my salary is a few thousand less than this. And I was told, they don't understand you're at the VA. I said, oh, okay, well, where does this letter go? Because I said, I hope I'm not paying taxes on this letter. And that it turned out that was entirely wrong. The Department of Medicine definitely, when Ted saw this letter, he said, well, our business manager said that's not the case in the Department of Medicine. He doesn't understand why the different departments can do different things as they choose. And that's when it all got corrected. So
Crazy things.
I think that lots of ways to, you could say, decrease people's salary, but in fact, you do have to return to some sort of merit-based system.
I know a lot of us are dealing now with the fact that we have these hospital companies that come in to manage the hospital that have a different sort of private practice salary base for those hired by the hospital versus those hired by the medical center. And we're struggling with that now, figuring out what the hospital down the street that's our hospital, a branch of our hospital, is the salaries there going to be higher than here and that sort of thing. So, but fortunately, I haven't heard in recent years people using the gender or the spouse salary or the spouse lack of salary as an excuse for more pay. So hopefully that's a bygone era, but I don't know. People will come up with all sorts of things. Anything else you wanted to talk about, Linda? You have any topics you wanted to bring up?
You do have to have many mentors. And sometimes, for instance, I think I told you about the importance of having a mentor that can understand the research system as well. We had, great research in the department, and that was a good thing for us. We knew that the basis of what we wanted to do was somewhat research-based. And it was unusual at that time to have urologists getting NIH grants. I applied for one in my first year faculty, and at that time received a review that I didn't get it. And I showed this to our chair and our research mentor, really. And he says, oh, well, you didn't get it. Well, okay. I said, I also sent it into the VA. A few months later, I got a note that I received it from the VA. So I took that money and ran.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it was there. And then about 3 or 4 months later, I get a call from the NIH and said, were you planning to resubmit your grant? And I said, no, because I got the money from the VA. And there was a silence. I said, well, NIH grants are more prestigious. I said, well, it seems like the money is the money. So he says, well, did you talk to anybody? He said, you would have gotten the money. You just had to send it in the second time around. Nobody gets it the first time. And the changes were minor. I said, well, nobody told me that. And it, as you know, NIH grants are a little bit more maybe prestigious just because it's a bigger pool. I had no idea. And so he said, you need to talk to somebody about how to read your grant review. And it's true. I only showed it to one. I thought it was terrible. I didn't get my money. So I thought, okay, try again. Yeah. So it's very important. Those kinds of things are really important that you have people who you can go to. And later, that person was still the program director in urology. And I had then moved to Stanford, so I no longer had the VA grants, and I had to apply again. And he was glad to see that I continued to try there.
Great. Well, it's been so good to talk to you. I know we try to catch up on Zoom periodically and see each other at meetings, but this has been special to kind of talk about your outlook on things.
And let's try to catch up again at maybe upcoming meeting.
Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, rate the podcast 5 stars, and share with a friend. If you have any questions or comments, DM us at _BackTable Euro on Instagram, LinkedIn, or X. BackTable is hosted by myself, Ruchika Talwar,
Jose Silva,
and Suzette Sutherland.
Our audio team is led by Kieran Gannon, with support from
Aaron Bowles, Gabe DeGrazio.
And Josh Spencer.
Design and digital marketing led by Brian Schmitz.
Social media and PR by Chi Dang.
Administrative support provided by Judy Dela Cruz.
Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.